Welcome back to a brand new video, folks. Today, I am bringing you the Season 27 Tal Rasha Meteor guide. Now, one thing to note about this build is it is also going to continue to work after the season. This is not like other certain builds that purely rely on the Angelic Crucible powers. Now, in order to find out if this is a good build for you, let's start by going over some of the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. First one is that this build does massive amounts of damage. This build also has the potential to push to GR 150. The build is also very aesthetically satisfying. If we throw a couple meteors right here, the screen just gets filled up with animations and it looks incredible. Another pro, particularly for Season 27, is that the Tal Rasha set is the Hadrig's gift set. So when you finish your season journey, you're going to get this full set. And the last pro that I'd like to cover is that this build is very good in group play as a trash killer. Okay, let's move into some of the cons. The first and maybe most important one is that it is a very squishy build. It is very easy to die with this build. The next con is that, as you'll notice, there's a delay on damage. When I'm casting these meteors, they're not immediately going towards the target, they're falling from out of the sky. So your timing and your aim is very important. Okay, another con is that you have absolutely no immunity to crowd control effects. So your character could easily become frozen in place or get stuck or potentially even feared. The next one is that there is a delay when you're casting as well. You get stuck and you kind of become stagnant in place while you're casting. And the cast is kind of on the slow side. Another con is that this is a convention of elements build. A lot of people do not like to have to play around the COE cycle. So if you're not into that, then I really would not recommend this build because it is very reliant on your cold rotation for the convention of elements. To round out the cons, another one is that you are moving slow. You're not like a whirlwind barbarian who's quickly getting across the map, or a strafe impale demon hunter, or a God demon hunter. Your speed is really slow. And the very last one that I'd like to add is that I don't feel like this build is easy to play. I wouldn't say it's one of the hardest builds in the game, but it kind of falls maybe somewhere to the medium hard difficulty, somewhere in that range. Now, before we dive into the gear, there's one thing that I would like to note. This is a guide for the Comet version, or the cold version of the Tal Rasha Meteor build. You can also play the Star Pact version, which is the arcane version of the Meteor, and is also very capable of clearing up to GR 150. Okay, so let's start with the amulet. The first thing to note is that I do have the correct rolls on this. However, they're not particularly great rolls. If you're going with the Comet build, you're going to want to stack that cold damage. And of course, we always want to take crit hit chance and crit hit damage wherever we can. And we need to get the socket in our jewelry as well so that we can use our legendary gems. Moving on to the helmet. I do have the correct rolls on here, but again, they're not quite perfect. But you want that int, crit hit chance, and meteor damage. Moving on to the shoulders. I do have fine shoulders, however, I would much rather have more area damage, and I'd also rather have armor over all resist. Because we're playing an intellect class, whenever we get main stat points, it is also adding all resistance to our character, and so we want to stack armor over all resistance wherever we can. Next up is the gloves. I do have the correct rolls on here, but once again, they are very far from being optimal. But these are the correct stats that you're going to want to roll on your gloves. For the chest piece, same thing here. I've got all the correct stats, so just try to roll them as high as you can. And you're also going to want to try to go for ancient items so that you can augment them. Unfortunately, I have not played this character enough to get all ancients, and so I'm not nearly as strong as I could be. So for the wrists, they're a little unusual. I took this build off of Max Roll. Link to that build in the description down below. I would highly recommend checking it out. These are the correct stats according to the Max Roll build. Having life per hit is a little unusual. That's not something you typically see on a character for the wrist piece. Having said that, if you want to follow the Max Roll guide, I would recommend rolling just like this. So for the first ring, we have a convention of elements that was mentioned earlier. This build is highly dependent on the convention of elements. We do not have perfect stats on this ring. We would much rather have area damage instead of intelligence. Additionally, for your convention of elements, you are going to want to roll the percent increased damage as high as possible. 177% on my ring is not good enough. You're going to want to at least go for about 190. But of course, when you're first starting the season or you have a new character, it's okay to take a lower convention of elements, but make sure that you are constantly searching for a one that has that higher percent of increased damage. Moving on to the next ring, we have the Halo of Carini. One thing that I will say is that my rolls are absolutely incorrect on this. I would not like to have life per hit, I would rather have crit hit damage, and I would not like to have intelligence, I would rather have area damage. In addition to that, I only rolled the 66% decrease to damage on this, and you're gonna want to get this as close to 80 as possible. I have not had good luck with this ring this season, and so this is just what I have to use for the time being. Hopefully you find a better one than this by the time you have all this gear on your character. Next up is the belt. These are almost the correct rolls, however, once again, I would rather have armor instead of all resist. Moving up next is the pants, and these are the correct rolls. However, one thing that I will note is that for the gems that you put into your chest and into your legs, you're actually going to want strength instead of intelligence. It's a really strange dynamic with these intelligence classes, but we are very squishy, and so we want to stack as much armor as we can, and a great way to do that is to stack rubies in our gear instead of intelligence gems. Okay, for the boots, you're going to want to use Nilfr's Boast. Now, one thing that I will say is my rolls are not ideal on this piece. You're going to want intelligence, vitality, meteor damage, and armor. In addition, you'll notice the bonus effect on this that increases the damage of meteor, so try to roll that as high as possible. I got 873, which is not bad, but the closer you get to 900, the better. Okay, the last piece is the Grand Vizier. Now, you can also use the Smoldering Core as opposed to this. Whichever one you're using, you're going to want to put the other one in the cube so that you can benefit from both of their effects. These are the ideal rolls for the Grand Vizier. You're going to want that 10% increased damage, intelligence, 24% area damage on hit, and you're going to want to make sure that your Angelic Crucible rolls the effect for the Storm Armor. Okay, moving into the skills. We're going to use Black Hole with Spell Steal. Spell Steal is really nice. It's going to grant us increased damage for each enemy that we pull into the black hole. It is also going to reduce the damage that enemies deal to us who are trapped inside of the black hole. The next one is Meteor with Comet. As we had discussed earlier, this is the cold variant of the build. You can alternatively use Meteor with Star Pact if you want to go arcane. Next up is Magic Weapon with Conduit. We're definitely going to want that Conduit because each enemy that we hit is going to restore 3 arcane power to us. This is going to allow us to stay engaged in combat and continue to cast meteors as often as possible. Okay, so for this build, we're also going to be using Teleport with Safe Passage. As I had mentioned earlier, as one of the cons for this build is it is a little squishier. The nice thing about the Safe Passage is if we accidentally teleport into a group of enemies, at least we're taking reduced damage for a period of time and hopefully can get out. We're also going to be using Storm Armor with Power of the Storm. This is also going to help us keep our arcane power up so that we can continually remain engaged in combat. For the last skill, we're going to use Familiar with Sparkflint. This is great because you don't have to worry about it. You just set the skill and it continues to buff your character and you're just going to do more damage. In fact, we have 3 skills that are like that with this build. We have the Magic Weapon, the Storm Armor, and the Familiar. So you're not going to have to worry about too much skill management. You're just going to be mostly casting Meteors, Black Hole, and Teleport, so you only have 3 skills to worry about with this build. One thing that I will say is that Storm Armor does have a nice effect with the Angelic Crucible this season. Every 30 seconds, you're going to be able to cast a bolt of lightning that will instantly kill a regular enemy or deal a very large amount of damage to an elite or a Rift Guardian. We're going to go pretty quick through the passives. We're going to be using Elemental Exposure to deal more damage. We're also going to be using Power Hungry to deal damage to enemies that are further away. Galvanizing Ward is a very good passive because it's going to help us stay alive with this build. And then lastly, Blur, fairly self-explanatory. Once again, just to keep us alive with this build, we will want to be using Blur. Okay, so for the next thing that I want to go over, we're going to be using Bane of the Stricken, Zay's Stone of Vengeance, and Bane of the Trapped. Getting into the cube, we're going to be using either the Smoldering Core or the Grand Vizier. Once again, you can use either one on your character and either one in the cube. You just need to have the effects from both of them. The Smoldering Core has a really interesting effect where lesser enemies or trash are lured to the impact side of your meteor. This is great because meteor has a delay on hitting the ground, and so enemies being lured into it makes it much better. In addition to that, the Smoldering Core also just grants us more damage on the meteor. Mempo of Twilight is absolutely essential, and it's really what makes this build aesthetically shine and just deal substantial amounts of damage. It grants us the rune Meteor Shower to all casted meteors. And lastly, we're going to be using the Ring of Royal Grandeur because we're only using 5 pieces of the Tal set and 2 pieces of Oghilds, so we want to benefit from the 6-piece bonus and the 3-piece bonus of the 2 sets that we're using. Alright, before we dive into some tips and tricks, I want to mention that you should be using the Templar with this build. Make sure that when you're gearing him, you're getting as many emanating effects as possible, 25,000 strength, and stacking as much cooldown reduction as possible so that he can cast his heal spell more quickly. The Templar is the only follower that actually benefits from cooldown reduction in this game, so make sure to get it wherever you can on his gear. For the gear on the Templar, I would recommend going to Max Roll, link in the description down below, to the build guide for this, which is also going to have a Templar gearing guide. Unfortunately, I have not played this character enough to actually gear out my Templar, so go check out their guide for the Templar build in the description down below. Okay, let's dive into some tips and tricks with this build so that you can play this as optimally as possible. The first one is every time that you see a shrine or a pylon, you're going to want to cast a meteor over it before you actually engage with it. This way, once you engage with it, the enemies will spawn and meteors will already be hitting the ground in the area where the elites have spawned. Another one, we had kind of mentioned this earlier. If you look down here, you'll see that I have the Storm Armor recharging buff. Every time that this hits 30, you can cast the Storm Armor to bolt and kill any trash minion instantly, or deal a large amount of damage to any champion, elite, or Rift Guardian. I will note that the damage for it is actually pretty good. It's not quite as good as I was expecting based on the description of the Angelic Crucible, however, it is absolutely worth casting to get that additional damage in. Okay, the next thing to note is that we are using a Zay Stone of Vengeance, so we're going to want to keep distance from our enemies to build up more damage. Now, I did just release a video about Zay's Stone of Vengeance, which I would highly recommend that you check out. It is actually a much better gem than you would think based on the description in-game of how it works. I'll also go ahead and drop a link to that video down below in the description if you're interested in checking that out. In addition to the Zays, we're also using Power Hungry, so we want to stay further away from our enemies to actually deal more damage. This will also help us stay alive. Okay, so another tip or trick for this build is maybe a little obvious to some players, but when you're casting your meteors, you're going to want to be stepping back between casts so that you can keep your distance between you and the enemy. This will also help you get out of the way of any effects that are on the ground, such as poison, frost, or fire that are dealing damage to you. And the last one that I'll note is that when you're doing higher grader rifts, teleporting into unknown areas can be really dangerous. You're going to want to be careful when you're teleporting to not end up in the middle of a pack, because your teleport is not going to be usable again for at least several seconds or until you killed enough enemies to reset the cooldown. So now let's go ahead and get into some gameplay. I'm just going to kind of show off some of the experiences that I've had in greater rifts today, anywhere from GR 110 to about 120, which, considering my really poor quality gear, I would say is very good. This build, even with suboptimal gear, absolutely has the potential to run some medium-high grader rifts pretty quick once you've got yourself set up. Alright, so let's dive right in. Alrighty folks, I hope you enjoyed the gameplay. There is one thing that I wanted to show off that I got in these runs. We got a really nice Halo of Carini drop, and so now I've got a much better piece than I had demonstrated during the gear portion of this. I'm pretty happy to have it, but it still only rolled 68% reduction to damage. Nevertheless, still a big upgrade. Folks, if you try out this build, please leave a comment down below and let me know what you think of it. Hopefully it works out well for you, and you can push to higher GR tiers than you've ever done before. As always, I really appreciate your time, and thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next one.